start by asking yourself what really matters to you. The things that don't matter can clutter your mind and take up your time. So until you've spent some time identifying what's really important and what's not important, you're going to find it impossible to discard anything. And the unimportant are going to get in your way of what you really want. Today, we've invited a retirement planning specialist as our guest speaker, Heather Hooper. And through her career experience in retirement planning, Heather has identified unique phases that we all go through in retirement. Now, you'll all have your own unique retirement experience, but being aware of these phases that everyone goes through will give you a framework within which to make decisions, personal decisions that are uniquely right for you. So please join me in welcoming our guest speaker, Heather Hooper.
Okay, so thank you, Michelle, so much for that warm introduction. I am incredibly honored to be here on behalf of Sterling and Tucker to talk about a topic that is near and dear to my heart, which is planning for your future. I am absolutely astonished at how many people came out on a Saturday morning to join us here and learn and listen and participate in what arguably is the most important conversation of your life. In all of my 15 plus years of experience in studying the retirement industry, I have actually yet to meet a single individual who felt as though they saved too much or planned too well. So that is part of the reason why I love this topic, because it is something where I can always educate myself and figure out ways forward that are going to help other people. The purpose of today's presentation is really to dispel common myths and misconceptions associated with retirement and help you create a path forward that really helps define a fulfilling and successful retirement that has security, dignity, and peace of mind. Like with anything in life that's worth it, retirement is simply not a point A to point B journey. There are going to be peaks, there are going to be valleys, and of course, there are going to be detours. But by simply refining the areas to plan for, so that you know and understand what those are, and knowing that those areas are going to come up for you numerous times throughout retirement, it can really help clear a path forward to that successful and fulfilling retirement experience that we all hope that we'll have. Today's agenda is simple. We're going to start by covering the 3 phases of retirement that Michelle had mentioned and what those mean to you. And I would encourage everyone in this audience to look through that lens for the remainder of the presentation. From there, we're going to move on to common beliefs associated with retirement and the reality of those myths. From there, we're going to focus on what you really need to plan for before wrapping it up with how you can take control of your retirement journey. So without further ado, let's dig into what those 3 phases of retirement look like. For the purpose of today's presentation, we've got an age range associated with retirement of about 60 years old to past 90, with each one of these phases representing between 5 and 15 years. We'll start with early retirement, which is oftentimes marked as the active phase and is also considered an extension of your pre-retirement lifestyle, but with more time for spending and extracurricular activities like travel. From there, it moves into middle retirement. Middle retirement is sometimes when health and energy start to decline a little bit. So some of those activities may fall away, and there's more of a focus on spending quality time doing the things that you love the most with the people you love the most, and of course making sure that your money will last. And from there, it ebbs into late retirement, which is really when health and energy tend to decline even more. Activity-related spending falls away, and you're going to focus most of your time and energy on managing your quality of life, your health, and spending time with your loved ones, as well as really focusing on finalizing that legacy and making sure that everything is in good order. Also depicted up on the screen, you'll see what is referenced as the retirement spending smile. So as you can see at the top, you've got that uptick at the beginning that's oftentimes associated with that activity-related spending that you have when you've got more time. It tends to decline in the middle, and then there's oftentimes an uptick at the end for healthcare-related expenses. This isn't what everyone is going to experience, but it's a general idea for you to keep in mind as it relates to retirement. From here, we're going to dig into retirement myths versus today's reality, now that we have a little bit more context around the situation. Myths like, all I need is a dollar figure and a date. I think we've all been taught this. I think most people have probably seen that Goya commercial where the person's walking around with a number on their shoulder. There's another person trimming the hedge, and they're talking about their number being a gazillion bazillion. So we know that the number is absolutely necessary, and we know that it's good to have a date in mind. But a dollar figure and a date without a plan are just far too simplistic. There's just too many other influencers when you think about it. Where you're going to live, family care, what does your lifestyle look like? What about health-related challenges? How about work? In fact, you can see from screen, 71% of people aren't even saving enough for retirement, so that kind of throws that concept out the window immediately. 60% have to retire sooner than they had planned, and 52% of Americans are at risk of a lower standard of living in retirement for a variety of reasons. So when you think about it, a dollar figure and a date just simply aren't going to get you there. Moving on to myth number 2. Retirement is the longest single phase of life. A lot of people think about retirement as that couple walking hand in hand down the beach, maybe taking naps at noon and drinking wine at 4 o'clock. And while that's absolutely fabulous, and most of us would like to do that for a 30-year period of time, it's not probably going to be sustainable. We had already talked about the fact that there's 3 main phases of retirement that last between 5 and 15 years, generally speaking. But it would be silly to think that any one of those phases would be static. When has any 5 to 10 year period of your life been the same? There's going to be multiple phases that everybody experiences, these stages we go through. Oftentimes before retirement even, there's a little bit of a fantasy of all the things you're going to do once you're no longer working. That first year of retirement can bring some stress with it. And then there's the honeymoon phase. This is always associated with retirement, where you're crossing all those items off your bucket list and you're spending your money and you're enjoying your life. But as we know, honeymoons rarely last and are oftentimes followed by routine. Routines can become boring, so there's oftentimes going to be a reorientation exercise that you go through before falling into contentment. These are just 6 stages. So those 6 stages are probably going to repeat themselves along your journey. So it's definitely something to keep in mind. And again, dispels the myth that retirement is the longest single phase of life. Myth number 3, I'll stop working. While that may be the case for some lucky people in this room, for the vast majority of us, we're going to incorporate work into our golden years in some way, shape, or form. In fact, 50% of current retirees work, have worked, or plan to work in retirement. The number of people over the age of 65 has actually tripled in the workforce since the 70s. And 7 in 10 pre-retirees say they want to work in retirement, probably for different reasons. To fill their day, to give them a reason to circle dates on the calendar. Moving on to myth number 4, I will live in the same home throughout retirement. This is kind of an interesting one because where we live influences how we live. And there are a lot of factors that need to be considered when it comes to taking a look at the home that you're currently in. Will it continue to support you as you age? Is it close to the people and the things that you need access to? Is it the right size? There are a lot of different factors that come into play. In fact, 40% of anyone reaching the age of 65 is targeted to enter an assisted living facility at some point in time. This doesn't have to be a bad or scary thing. In fact, most people make this choice actively because they want that social connection. They want that sense of community, plus a little bit of extra support. And 3 out of 5 Americans actually want to spend their golden years in another city or state. I live in California. California is really expensive. That may not be where I retire as a result of California being really expensive, in addition to the traffic. Myth number 5, Medicare will cover all of my healthcare expenses. While I'm sure no one in this room anticipates this number is going to be 100%, oftentimes people are surprised to learn that Medicare on average only covers 62% of out-of-pocket medical expenses. 62%? With longevity and the rising cost of healthcare, you really need to think through what is and what is not covered by Medicare. What's incorporated into that 38%? Medicare doesn't cover vision, it doesn't cover dental, it doesn't cover hearing aids, it doesn't cover foot care, and it doesn't cover long-term care. That's a big nut to swallow. Speaking of longevity, we'll move on to myth number 6, which is I'll retire at 65 and live another 5 to 10 years. Well, the great news is we are living longer than ever thanks to medical advances and healthier lifestyles. In fact, a healthy 65-year-old man has a 41% chance of living to the age of 85 and a 20% chance of living to the age of 90. A healthy 65-year-old woman has a 53% chance of living to 85 and a 32% chance of living to the age of 90. And a healthy 65-year-old couple, one of them has a 72% chance of living to 85, 45% chance of living to 90, and an 18% chance of living to 95 if they don't kill each other first. That's the trick. I'll also add that men over the last 6 years have been starting to keep pace with women. It's definitely something to consider as we often underestimate our own longevity. But this myth also has another side, which is I'll retire at 65. As noted in the earlier slide, many people have to retire earlier, or at 65, they simply haven't saved enough to bring them through another 20 or 30 years. And additionally, many people will choose to work beyond the age of 65 because they love what they do. So this is really a double-edged myth. And last, myth number 7, I won't need any help. Human beings need human beings, especially when it comes to complexity, which is definitely what retirement brings. It brings challenges, complexity, and it brings a tremendous amount of opportunities. It spans a very, very long time. So to think that you wouldn't need guidance and help from family and friends and your advisors that surround you and help you with this journey would be silly. In fact, 60% of working households currently use some type of financial professional to help them plan for retirement. And that number increases for retirees. 70% of retired households are using financial professionals to help them plan during retirement, to navigate that point A to point B journey that has so many peaks, valleys, and detours. What you may have noticed as we've gone through each one of these myths is that 5 common themes rise to the surface. Lifestyle, how we want to spend our time and our money, what that looks like. Work, health, which is arguably the biggest disruptor of all. Family, where those vulnerabilities and complex, uncomfortable conversations can come into play. And of course, legacy, making sure that your intentions are going to be carried out. We're going to start by digging into lifestyle. Again, this is about your aspirations. This is about your goals, living your values. This is about your hobbies, your interests, your social activities. This is about how you want to spend your time and your money, and of course, where you live. To use a quick example, as it relates to lifestyle, however, that really requires planning, you've got one individual who's worked in a very high stress, high earning capacity for 40 plus years. They want to retire, they want to travel internationally, they want to eat the most exquisite cuisine, stay in the nicest resorts, and golf at the best courses around the world. Versus another individual who maybe wants to sell their home, downsize, sit on the beach, reading that stack of books that's been accumulating dust for years. Those 2 lifestyles require very different planning. And again, need to be put through the lens of how your life is going to change as you age. The great news is there are a ton of things that you can control, such as planning with the phases in mind. Taking a look at early retirement, what should your lifestyle look like then? How is that going to change as you get a little bit older and older than that? Considering your living arrangements, taking a look at your home, taking a look at the proximity to the people, places, and things, taking a look at your health, taking a look at whether or not you want to stay in that location over the long haul. Spending plans. I know that this is something that the folks and team at Sterling and Tucker spend a lot of time on with all of their clients, is taking a look not at your money from a budgeting perspective per se, but spending plans. When you look at your lifestyle, really knowing how you're going to be applying your money in smaller increments of time can be incredibly empowering. 1 to 2 year periods. What do you want to be doing during those times, and how might that change? Smaller periods of time make it really easy to plan for and adapt as life changes. And aligning expectations. I'm sure this comes as a shock to most of you, but sometimes husbands and wives and partners and family don't agree. So it's necessary to make sure that everyone is on the same page as far as that lifestyle is concerned. Have you guys had that conversation? It's a really important one, and I would argue a lot of people haven't had deep conversations around that until the day is here for retirement to start. I'll tell a quick story. This is a client of one of the advisors that we partner with. For the purposes of today's presentation, their names have been changed. This is Jim and Sandy. Jim was in that really high stress job for years and years and years, 40 years at a corporation as an executive. He had dreams of grandeur when it came to his retirement. He wanted to travel internationally. He wanted to grab Sandy and take her with him everywhere. He wanted to eat at the most expensive restaurants. He really wanted to spend big and cross some items off of his bucket list. Sandy, however, had retired about 3 years earlier, and she was volunteering her time 30 to 40 hours per week down at the church. She was also spending time with the kids and with the grandchildren, and she was loving her life. When Jim came home from work on that final afternoon, he was really excited that they finally got to do all the things that he wanted to do. But when he sat down with Sandy, he realized that she was concerned. If they spent big at the beginning of retirement, they wouldn't have anything to leave their kids or their grandkids. She also really enjoyed the time that she was spending down at the church volunteering. It gave her a sense of purpose. So they were not aligned. And the great news is they have a great relationship and they were able to find a happy medium. Jim was able to join Sandy down at the church and focus on their international chapter, which allowed him to scratch that travel bug 2 times per year. They were able to save more effectively to ensure that they could leave a legacy, and he still got to spend time with Sandy while not taking her away from something that was really important to her. So that's a great lesson. Moving on from here to work. I think the last illustration of a couple does a great job of showing how work is more complex than we oftentimes give it credit for. When we first start working, it's all about financial stability when we're in our teens and our 20s, trying to make sure that we're living from paycheck to paycheck, able to pay our bills and live okay. But there's other elements of work that are oftentimes overlooked that come into play, especially as our jobs become careers and our careers become callings. There's status, there's social aspects, there's structure, something nice about being able to go someplace from 8 o'clock to 5 or from 12 o'clock to 3 or whatever that day looks like for you. And of course, there's purpose. So what we find oftentimes working with people who are getting closer to retirement, taking a look at what work means to them, is this list flips and purpose lands at the top. Incredibly important to really know and understand that these different buckets are going to factor in different ways for different people, but it's certainly more complex than oftentimes we do give it credit for. Again, there's a number of things that we can control. Hopefully, most of us are in a situation where we can control what type, how often, and how much. Not always, but oftentimes goes into the equation. But filling the gap of what work provides also lands at the top of that list. So going back to those 5 elements, picking through and figuring out which ones are most important to you. If it's status, how do you fulfill that if work stops or changes? If it's structure, what do you do to make your day feel organized? Think through that as it relates to work. Also making sure that your money is working for you, like managing your tax situation. Again, the team at Sterling and Tucker is going to step in and help you do that. When to take Social Security. This is arguably the most asked question of any financial advisor I've ever worked with. Do I take it early? Do I take it late? How do I consider my spouse's income? What happens if I start working again after being retired? How does that impact Social Security? This can be a really, really complicated question and definitely requires guidance and support. A distribution of pension, if you're lucky enough to have one. What does that need to look like? Oftentimes you have to organize that conversation through your former employer. Depends on age, depends on options, and it is definitely a complicated conversation. The need for additional income. If you're in a situation where you did retire early and maybe came across a financial challenge, what do you need to do to go back to work and factor in that additional income to your future? This is my dad, Jack. He does not know he's in this presentation. When my dad was 52 years old, he was fortunate enough to have done very well in business, and he was able to retire. He had 2 goals: not work and play golf. Needless to say, that's not a very well thought out plan, and my dad found himself with a lot of extra time on his hands. When he went down to the golf course, his friends weren't able to join them because most of them were still working. He'd go to the clubhouse and spend time by himself. So rapidly, he started driving my mom crazy. One day, my mom came home from work and she found all of the contents of the kitchen cupboards had been emptied out onto the countertops. When he called my mom called him into the kitchen and asked him what the heck he was thinking, he said he was bored. So he thought he would rearrange the kitchen cupboards, but once he got everything out onto the countertops, he realized she's the cook and he would have no idea how to put them back, so he left it there for her to clean up. Needless to say, my dad went back to work about 6 months after that. The interesting part for me, because I was much younger at the time, was he really relied on his friends and his family and his advisors to help guide him back to work. He had crossed financial stability off the list. That was no longer something that he felt he needed to concern himself with. But purpose, structure, social elements, and of course status came into play. My dad's always been very passionate about education. His mother was a teacher. So my dad came out of retirement to start Sylvan Learning Centers on the West Coast. And at 76, it's what he's still doing today. So it's a great example. Health, our next really, really big topic. And again, this is the one that has the most disruption to it. It can completely blow up your entire plan. When health is good, life is good. But when health starts to decline, it can impact your lifestyle. It can impact the work that you do. It has an incredible impact from a stress perspective on your family. And of course, it can erode the legacy that you've worked so hard to create. And it's really expensive. According to the last study done by Fidelity, the average cost for a healthy 65-year-old couple living in retirement for approximately 20 years is $275,000. Now again, this is an average, so it's the best of the worst and the worst of the best. I've seen these figures very low, and I've seen these figures exceed $350,000. And they're rising at a cost of 6% per year, far outpacing inflation. Now, does anyone in the audience have a guess as to what that increase has looked like since Fidelity started this study in 2002? How much have these costs increased? Anybody? I heard 80%, 60%, 100%, 70%. Since 2002. This is absolutely one of the biggest headlines that you're going to see out there right now is how do we manage this figure and how do we take a look at how we can actually ensure that it also doesn't get impacted tremendously by the 6% increase per year. How do you plan for that? Well, the good news is there are, again, a number of things that you can control as it relates to this topic. Healthy living is always number one on the list. There's lots of books about it. Taking a look at your family's medical history, making sure that you're going to regular doctor's appointments. Are you sleeping? Are you eating? Are you exercising? Do you not smoke? There's a skull and crossbones on the side of the packet. It's not a good idea. There's so many different things that we can control here that are really pretty easy. There's a book that I read a couple of years ago that I really loved that was called Younger Next Year. One of the reasons I love the book is it's got two elements to it. There's one book for men and there's one book for women. Because men and women age very differently, our bodies are very different, and we have different challenges. And it was really helpful to sort of wrap my mind around the perspective of how people can live really, really, really well and healthy into their late 80s and feel good. Understanding Medicare, Medicaid, other benefits that you have access to. The folks at Sterling and Tucker did a great job of talking about that a little bit earlier today. This is a complex topic. There's a lot to pick through. But there's a direct correlation with people living longer that take advantage and understand all the things that they have access to. What are the resources that are available, and how do you tap into those? Tracking your assets to the rising cost of healthcare. That 6% figure is a big piece of why that number is so scary. It keeps going up. Long-term care. If you're lucky enough to be in a position to secure this, do, because the longevity tables tell us we should. If you're not in that situation, make sure that you're earmarking assets to cover this cost, because it most certainly will come into play for most of us. Having an emergency fund. Oftentimes we think of an emergency fund for maybe our college years to cover a broken down car. When we enter retirement, as it relates to health, it has a different meaning. If you're already retired, as an example, and you're taking a distribution either from a pension or from a portfolio on a regular basis, and you have a healthcare challenge where you need to cover those costs, do you want a tax consequence on top of it because you had to withdraw additional funds from one of those portfolios? Nobody wants to have that. So setting money aside to be able to cover something like medical bills is important. Documenting what families should do in medical situations. As we saw from Mary's situation, she was really beside herself, unsure of what to do after her husband died. You don't ever want to put your family in a situation where they have to take action without knowing completely what it is you would have wanted them to do. That is a tremendous burden. Make sure you write it down. Don't just discuss it. It needs to be documented so that everyone's on the same page. Some interesting conversations can come out of that as well. This is another client of an advisor that we partner with, who again, names have been changed. This is Denise and Michael. When Denise and Michael first started working with our advisor partner, they hadn't even folded healthcare into their retirement planning equation. It was sort of a number floating out there that they just simply hadn't addressed. The good news is they worked with their advisor and they sat down and they mapped everything out. They secured some insurance that they thought would help protect them, and they took a look at that lump sum figure and they were able to put it aside in something that would grow over time. True story. It's a good thing they did, because 5 years later, Denise was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. That is a very expensive, mean disease. And thankfully, because they'd done some planning, it didn't take the stress out of the equation at all, but they knew they could cover the costs. They knew they could handle the expenses associated with that specialty care. And that's a burden that they were able to set aside, which was huge. Moving on to family. This is a really tricky area because it extends beyond your relationship with your spouse to your kids, your grandkids, sometimes extended family. This is where vulnerabilities are exposed, violated expectations can pop up, and you hold the responsibility for communicating and planning out how your journey through retirement is going to impact the people you love the most. There's 3 root causes of retirement unhappiness that can generally be correlated directly back to family. One is role ambivalence. If you're in a situation where one partner, as an example, has worked outside the home for 30, 40 years, while the other has been home managing the household with lots and lots of duties and responsibilities associated with that very big job, When the person who's been working outside the household comes home, how are those roles and duties and responsibilities split? Role ambivalence comes into play because that person who's been outside the home for so many years doesn't know what to do. And the person who's been managing the home doesn't really know how to have those conversations around, hey, I don't want you sitting on the couch. I need some help around here. The other thing I would add is, how do your roles change when you've almost been living separate lives for a really long time? I think there's a common joke that goes, I married you for love, not for lunch. And all of a sudden you're spending 24/7 with an individual who you didn't used to spend 24/7 with. You kind of have your own routines. That creates a lot of confusion for people, and it really requires a readjustment period. Poor communication goes along with everything. Can I see a show of hands here of anyone who has ever not had a conversation with someone just to avoid confrontation? Really? Only one or two of you. That's impressive. So when I take a look at that, and I oftentimes think sometimes of conversations that I will have with my husband in my head without having them with him, I realize that communication gets factored into everybody's relationships over time. But this is a tremendous change that you're going to be going through mentally, physically, and emotionally. So there's a lot of things that you need to be communicating about to make sure that you are on the same page. Poor communication is a big disruptor here, as is not setting proper expectations and having big assumptions. Just expecting that you know what your partner wants and how they want to spend their time is not enough. You need to align those expectations and make sure that in many instances you're choosing truth over harmony. Some of these conversations can be hard. Again, with family, there's a number of things that you can control, such as organization and simplification. That's the theme of today's conference, and it's so incredibly important. You don't want to leave your family in a situation like what Mary had to try and clean up. Bill's office was a complete disaster. How was she ever going to go through all of that paperwork to try and figure out where the bills were coming from, where the accounts were, what financial aspects of their retirement planning process were documented in any variety of different ways? Organization and simplification empowers your family to be able to move forward when something happens to you. It also empowers your family to help care for you as you start to change. Your role will change as you age, with your kids as an example. Is that documented? Have you had those conversations? Make sure you're organized. Make sure that it's really easy for people to reach onto a shelf and know what your intentions are and where things are at. Having open and honest dialogue and planning for unexpected time and money spent on things like aging parents. I'm in that situation now. I'm officially sandwich generation. I have a 10-year-old at home and parents in their 70s, and I'm caring for both. Boomerang kids. I love this term. These are the kids that go off to college and then they come home. They get married and then they get divorced and they come home. This is a common occurrence in today's economy, and we want to be able to help our kids out. But it's also something that can be a big disruptor when it comes to your own quality of retirement and how you're spending your money and time. So it's something to plan for. Funding education. A lot of people will earmark money for covering the cost of college, either for their own children or for grandchildren, without really thinking through, do I need to organize that further and maybe open a 529 plan? Think that through. Work with the team at Sterling & Tucker to make sure that those conversations are front and center. Spousal care. One of us is going to start to slip sooner than the other. These are tough conversations, but necessary ones, because we want to make sure that we're honoring that person that we love so much, that we're following what they would have wanted us to do to the degree that we can. Really tricky, but really necessary. And of course, retiring on your own. For most of us, one spouse will die before the other, unless you are already alone. How does that impact your journey? How does that impact where you live? How does that impact your lifestyle? How does that impact your health? How does that impact the rest of your family? You have to think that through. It's very important. Again, the great news is the team at Sterling and Tucker is very well prepared to have some of these awkward conversations and bring family in to discussions that maybe they're kicking and screaming to go to. You can see on screen we have an elephant in a therapist's office, and he's saying to the therapist, I'm right there in the room and no one even acknowledges me. It can be so easy to not focus on some of the conversations we need to be having because we don't feel comfortable with how to bring them up. But as illustrated by Mary's situation, it's really important to have these discussions. And it's really important to bring in that next generation and make sure they know what your intentions are as well. And our last area for planning is legacy. And I think this screen does a great job of showing how our choices now impact our future. But as we experienced through the skit that we saw, legacy is really complicated. It's not just about what happens when we're no longer here. It's about how do we leave our mark now? What traditions do you want to pass on beyond your time here on earth? How do you want to celebrate your life? How do you want to be remembered? Legacy is a big conversation, and part of the reason it's so incredibly uncomfortable to tackle is because we're talking about the one thing that we all have in common in this room, which is we are going to die someday, and that's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable, and for some people, it's scary. Legacy is a big conversation, but as you can see from watching Kanani and Michelle, both Michelle's and Lori and Richard go through this exercise of what it looked like for that widow, it's so necessary to take a look at planning for this now. My best friend from high school and I used to pine after her mother's jewelry. Gorgeous pieces that she would never, ever, ever let us touch, rightfully so. And Annie now lives with Tracy, my best friend. She still has all that jewelry. And she just realized a couple of years ago that if she only left it to Tracy and Tracy's daughter after she died, they wouldn't wear it. And it was only going to make them sad because they would associate those pieces with her death. It's a good example of little things that we can do with legacy right now to celebrate our lives, to celebrate our stuff. Further to that, going back to the process of organization and simplification, in Sweden, they actually have a process called a death cleanse, which is a really horrible term. And that death cleanse starts between the ages of 50 and 60 years old. And this is when people take a look at not only their financial lives, their bills, their credit cards, the accounts that they've accumulated over the years and start to consolidate those. They start to look at all the stuff they've accumulated and realize and recognize your kids may not want your china. They may not want the antiques. They may not recognize the value in some of the things that you recognize the value in. So in Sweden, they go through this exercise early so they can get their house in order. So just in case something happens, they're not leaving a mess. It's simple. It's organized. Again, with legacy, there's a number of things you can control, like planning now. This entire educational seminar has really been focused on that, and I don't doubt that everyone in this room is set up for success, but continue that process. It can be easy to go through that exercise now and sort of forget about it for 5 to 10 years, and as a reminder, life doesn't stay the same. You want to make sure your intentions are documented and they're up to date. Run different scenarios as to how your life may change as you age, as life happens along the way. Leverage tax advantaged gifts now, as opposed to just in the future. Make sure wills, beneficiary designations, trusts are up to date. I have more beneficiary designation horror stories than I care to admit because I came from the 401k record keeping world where I was dealing with participant accounts on a regular basis. I cannot tell you how many ex-spouses ended up with money that was not intended for them. That's just one of many beneficiary designation stories that can derail an entire situation. Life insurance. If this is something that you're in a position to secure, then secure it. It's a good play as far as legacy is concerned. For myself, I just secured this about 2 years ago because my financial life had finally become complex enough that I needed to take responsibility for it and know that if something happened to me, I want to make sure that my daughter and my husband are going to be okay financially. Legacy, as we mentioned, can be a really tough conversation and difficult to wrap your head around. But know that you're not alone when it comes to not tackling really important things. As many of you may be aware, Prince died without a will. That's shocking to me. A $50 to $200 million estate. And you know what? His intentions will never be carried out. Ever. Because he didn't have it in writing. He didn't write it down. He didn't involve financial professionals to help guide him. He didn't map it out. Another example is Michael Jackson. So Michael Jackson, when he died a little less than 10 years ago, he had a lot of financial professionals in his life. But they weren't talking. They didn't have lines of communication open like the folks at Sterling and Tucker, where everyone was on the same page and briefed on his situation. So as a result, his estate is still fighting with the IRS, which is amazing. And the last example, which makes me the most sad, but also was the one that was planned, is Robin Williams. When Robin Williams died, he left all of his intellectual property to his estate, avoiding the tax consequences that could have been created. He was incredibly well documented, and he knew that what he chose as a path forward for himself was going to create a tremendous amount of grief for his family, in addition to all of us who loved him so. But he documented everything and made sure that he was organized and everything had been simplified so that his family could move on rather than being buried in piles and piles of paperwork. So we're on to the last section of today's presentation, which is how you can take control of your retirement journey. As we all know, retirement's going to be unique to each and every one of us. Maybe in early retirement, you've got a boomerang kids situation that you need to handle. And then in middle retirement, a healthcare challenge that you have to get over and get beyond. Maybe late retirement brings the situation where you're able to finally sell that family business and go big and cross all those items off of your bucket list. The journey is going to look different for every single person in this room, and it's going to require personalized planning for everyone. Even your spouse is going to have a different experience than you are. We encourage everyone, of course, to avoid the confusion associated with retirement. Ask the questions that you feel you need to ask. Be bold. Don't be afraid. Take control of your future by considering each one of the elements that we talked about today: lifestyle, work, health, family, and legacy. Write down what really resonated with you, what you feel like you need to tackle sooner rather than later, and get clarity. Sit down with the folks at Sterling and Tucker and dig in. It may take more than one meeting. It may take communication with your family that you don't feel super comfortable with having, but you know you need to have. This is a journey. This isn't something that you just get to click a switch on. But get that clarity in your life and keep it front and center. We often use what's called a 360-degree life map for this exercise. This is where we are able to clarify our vision for the future, harmonize work and life, tackle each one of those topics that we talked about today and keep them front and center. If building a legacy is top of mind for you, if helping and protecting your family is your number one item, these are things that you can write down and keep dynamic in the conversation, as well as your needs, your wants, and your wishes. And going back to those stages of retirement, life is going to change. Your needs, your wants, your wishes, your areas of focus, they can change in a heartbeat. So make sure that you're staying on top of those conversations and not just sweeping them under the carpet. Before I go, everyone should have in your packet a retirement checklist. This is your homework. We're encouraging everyone here to go home tonight, fill it out, maybe separately from your significant other or loved ones, and then sit down and compare notes. You may be surprised that you have some gaps, some things that you want to focus on, or potentially things where your expectations weren't aligned. It's a simple exercise. It shouldn't take more than 5 minutes, but it can really help you create that path forward that will allow you the freedom to enjoy retirement with peace of mind. Thank you all so much.